All right, today's Fair Housing and Power Hour session is on preventing sexual harassment in housing. My name is Brittany Millinger, and I'm the Fair Housing Training and Outreach Coordinator here at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. So in our short hour today, we are going to cover a couple training goals. Our goals for these Fair Housing and Power Hour sessions are always to provide you a short practical overview of fair housing topics. And we always start with just a brief overview of who we are as an agency, as well as fair housing laws and protected classes and discriminatory acts. Today, we'll be discussing sexual harassment in housing. We'll talk a little bit about what that looks like and how we can work together to prevent sexual harassment, how you can file a fair housing complaint if you believe that you've experienced harassment or discrimination. And we'll also reserve some time at the end for any fair housing questions you have. I will be keeping an eye on the chat today. So if you do have questions throughout the presentation, I want you to feel free to go ahead and put your questions in the chat as well, and I'll address as many as I can throughout the presentation as well. I do want to recognize that this can be a sensitive topic, so if you do need to step away from the presentation at any point in time, please feel free to do so. And this will be recorded, so you can always rejoin or fast forward to a different section of the presentation if you find that helpful. All right, so the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission has been around since 1955. So we are the leading civil rights enforcement agency in the state of Pennsylvania. And our mission has two parts. First off, we exist to enforce Pennsylvania's non-discrimination laws, including both the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, as well as the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act. These laws ensure that people are able to live, work, and learn free from discrimination. If you believe that you've experienced discrimination, you can file a complaint with our agency and have the situation investigated by one of our investigators. But beyond that, we also work to promote equal opportunity for all in Pennsylvania. So we do that through trainings, such as the one that you're on today, as well as hosting speakers, hosting events, and providing other opportunities for folks to engage with our work and to explore ideas and practices and programs that really help to foster a Pennsylvania that's inclusive for all of us. I want to highlight the work of our advisory councils and our social justice ambassadors, which are volunteers that work to further the mission of our commission, and they're huge partners in the work that we do. We serve the entire state of Pennsylvania. So our western region, that's served by our Pittsburgh office. The central region, which reaches up into northeastern Pennsylvania as well, that's served by our Harrisburg office. And then the southeastern portion of the state is served by our Philadelphia office. These regional offices do all the day-to-day work of accepting complaints, conducting investigations, and the central office, which I work out of, does some of the administrative and outreach functions, such as providing trainings like we're on today. I mentioned our laws just a minute ago, and I want to give you a little breakdown of what they cover. So the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act covers employment, housing, commercial property, and public accommodations, as well as primary and secondary education. So it covers the bulk of what we cover. And then the Fair Educational Opportunities Act covers post-secondary education, such as college, technical schools, trade schools, things like that. But of course, housing is our focus today. And that's going to be the extent of which I cover what our agency does until I get into the investigative process at the end of the presentation today. But if you would have any questions about any of our initiatives or programs or the work that we do, you can always reach out. And my contact information will be at the end of this slide deck. And you will receive all of the materials as well as the recording later this week. So I want you to know that you will get all these resources. We're going to start off by briefly covering are fair housing laws. So we have laws at the federal, the state, and the local level that ensure fair housing protections. So at the federal level, the most well-known is the Fair Housing Act. There's also the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, which provide protections for individuals with disabilities. As I mentioned just a minute ago, at the state level, there's the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. And at the local level, there are local ordinances that may provide additional protections, additional protected classes of individuals who have housing-related protections. So there are over 70 different local ordinances throughout the state. For those that are joining today, if you want to pop in the chat, if you know of a local fair housing or a local human relations ordinance in your area, please feel free to put that in the chat. So that way we can see what areas folks are coming from, and if you're familiar with any local human relations commissions or ordinances that are active in your area. Diving a little deeper into fair housing laws, there are two main goals. So the first one is ending housing discrimination. We don't want anyone to be kept out of housing opportunities because of aspects of their identity. But beyond that, we're also seeking to promote diverse, inclusive communities. We call that affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH for short. So that's defined as taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics. So it acknowledges that we've got systemic issues in our housing. Communities have historically been kept out of housing opportunities because of governmental policies, private practices, and there's work to be done to ensure that everyone has equal housing opportunities. And we all can take part in that work to affirmatively further fair housing. Our fair housing laws cover the sale and the rental of housing, as well as housing-related transactions. So when I talk about housing-related transactions, that's all of the industries and players that can impact housing as well. So that could include insurance, that could include appraisals, mortgages and lending, anything, any industries that would impact someone's ability to get housing, to get a fair price for their housing, to insure their housing. It's all a part of housing, so it falls under the fair housing umbrella. Likewise, the types of housing that's covered by fair housing laws is broad as well. So that includes anything from apartments to single-family homes, manufactured housing, condominiums, public housing, nursing home, dormitories, and more. Even some types of shelters are covered under fair housing. There are two main types of discrimination or discrimination theories that we talk about in fair housing. The first one is disparate treatment. That's what most folks would think of when they think of housing discrimination. So that's treatment that directly discriminates against a member of a protected class. So I'm not going to rent to you because you have a family. It's pretty direct. Disparate impact, on the other hand, may be a little bit more subtle. So it's a policy that often looks neutral, that looks neutral in its face, but it's got a disproportionate impact on members of a protected class. So looking at familial status or the presence of a family, a policy that might look neutral on its face, but have a disparate impact on a family with kids, could be an overly restrictive occupancy standard beyond what's put in place by the local municipality. Say, you know what, you can only have one person per bedroom. Families are more likely to have more people in a household, and that may limit their ability to access housing. So that could be an example of disparate impact. All right, we're going to discuss protected classes, but before I advance to the next slide, I'd love to invite you to put in the chat any protected classes that you're familiar with. Could be at the federal level, could be at the state level. Let's see if we can get them all named. I know we've got a number of people on the call here today. So if you would like to participate, I'd like to encourage you to put any protected classes that you're familiar with into the chat. Okay, ancestry. Thank you, Esther. Absolutely. Anyone else? All right, we've got a quiet group today, so I'm going to move on in the interest of time. Gender identity, yep, that's covered under the protected class of sex, which I will get into in just a moment. Thank you. Age, absolutely. So at the federal level, under the Fair Housing Act, we've got 7 main protected classes. That's race, color, national origin, familial status, religion, sex, and disability. At the state level, under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, we've got those 7 plus a couple additional ones. And I do want to mention that that religious creed is under the state level, which is very similar to religion. But we also add age, 40 and above, ancestry, as well as the use, handling, or training of support animals for disability. Now, if you have a local ordinance in your municipality, it's possible that you have additional protected classes beyond what's listed on here. A great example of that is source of income. I know there are several municipalities, including Philadelphia, State College, and Erie, that have source of income protections, which means that a housing provider needs to give equal opportunity to folks regardless of where their income comes from. To obtain housing, but that's not something that we have at the federal or the state level at this point. I want to further define just a few of these. So familial status includes families with children who are under the age of 18, who are living with parents or legal custodians. It includes people who are pregnant, and it also includes people who are securing the custody of children under the age of 18, including foster children, not just biological children. There are a couple of age-related exemptions to familial status protections. So there is housing that's specifically designated for seniors through the Housing for Older Persons Act, 2 different types of community, 55 and older, as well as 62 and over communities. So depending on the situation, their children and families may be excluded. And you can find more details on this slide, as well as in the Housing for Older Persons Act. So I want to take a moment to discuss sex as a protected class under the Human Relations Act as well. When you saw those lists of protected classes, you didn't see sexual orientation or gender identity listed either at the federal or the state level. However, PHRC recently finalized regulations. They became finalized in August of 2023, and these establish that the term sex may refer to pregnancy status, childbirth status, breastfeeding status, sex assigned at birth, gender identity or expression, affectional or sexual orientation, and differences in sex development. So it defines sex fairly broadly. And we use these regulations as we accept complaints, conduct investigations, as well as adjudicate cases. And the last protected class that I want to define in more detail is disability. So that's defined as a physical or a mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of a person's major life activities. Some examples of this include caring for oneself, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, or working. And this is not an exhaustive list, it's just some examples. So the Fair Housing Act protects those who have a disability, those who have a history of a disability, as well as those who are perceived as having a disability. The first group is pretty straightforward, of course, those who have a disability, but those who have a history of a disability or who are perceived or regarded as having a disability, they may receive adverse treatment on the basis of someone's perception of their abilities or disabilities based on their knowledge of their medical history. So they fall under these protections as well to make sure that they receive fair treatment in their housing. All right, so fair housing laws establish discriminatory actions. So housing providers, other housing professionals need to make sure that they steer clear of these practices to make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to receive housing and to use and enjoy their housing. So there cannot be any discriminatory statements made as you're advertising property or providing housing. Can't make any discriminatory inquiries throughout the housing process, such as asking someone as they're applying for housing if they're a member of a protected class, if they have a disability, if they have kids, if they're a senior, things like that, unless it's connected with senior housing, of course. Steering is discriminatory, which is basically directing someone towards specific housing opportunities, directing people away from other housing opportunities based on race, on ancestry, based on another protected class, not sharing all of the available housing opportunities to everyone who's asking. Refusing to sell, lease, or finance housing. Appraisals that are unfair and that would be based on someone's protected class rather than the market value of the house. Predatory lending or redlining, discriminating in the housing terms or conditions. So if the lease terms are not equal for all tenants and the conditions of the housing that's being provided. If the services and facilities that's being provided is done unequally through enforcing the lease differently for different people, providing differing amounts of maintenance or quality of maintenance, letting some folks use the facilities on premises, but others not. That could be discriminatory if it's on the basis of protected class. And then refusal to provide reasonable accommodations and modifications for individuals with disabilities. That is discriminatory as well. Today, we're focusing on the last one, sexual harassment in housing. If you want a more detailed overview of what's considered to be discriminatory, next month we're doing a general fair housing overview in our Empower Hour. So we'll get into a lot more details on all of those, but I want to spend the bulk of our time today on sexual harassment. All right, so the term harassment, that covers a wide range of behaviors of an offensive nature. So it's commonly understood as behavior that's intended to disturb or upset, and it's characteristically repetitive. It's typically intentional behavior, which is found offensive or intimidating. So that's a pretty broad definition. And I want to be clear that harassment can be on the basis of any protected class, whether that's race, religion, national origin, disability, age, any of those. And the behavior must be unwelcomed. But we're going to focus in on sexual harassment today. So that's a form of discrimination on the basis of sex. It's prohibited by our federal and state laws. And in September 2016, HUD released a final rule on this as well, and we'll provide that link in the follow-up materials. There are two main types of harassment. The first is quid pro quo. So that's when a housing provider subjects a person to an unwelcome request or a demand for sexual favors. And submitting is a condition of obtaining or maintaining their housing or housing-related services. So that's a Latin phrase. It means this for that. It's, you know what, you can't make the rent. Well, how about you do this for me instead? Oh, you want your plumbing fixed? How about you take care of me? It's tying the request for sexual favors to providing housing or housing-related services. A hostile environment, on the other hand, is when a person is subjected to unwelcome conduct that's sufficiently severe or pervasive, such as it interferes with or deprives the tenant of their right to use and enjoy their housing. And when we're talking about severe behavior, it's behavior that sufficiently offends, humiliates, or degrades the victim. That includes most physical contact, threatening or vulgar behavior. It interferes with the victim's ability to live in their housing, and it alters the condition of the housing, creating a hostile or abusive environment. And it really undermines the victim's sense of well-being. When we're talking about pervasive behavior that's widespread and it happens frequently. There are a number of different forms of harassment, and you can see them listed on here. So that ranges from physical, which could include touching, kissing, or groping, verbal, which would include sexual comments, jokes, and name calling, visual, such as obscene pictures or objects that are displayed, as well as written, which would include anything from texts to notes to letters to social media, anything that happens in the written word. To make it a little bit more tangible, there's some concrete examples that have been reported to HUD's Office of the Inspector General, such as a landlord who asked for sex in exchange for renting an apartment and accepting a housing choice voucher, um, which is also known as a Section 8 voucher. So a tenant who fell behind on rent and the building manager demanded sex from the tenant in order to avoid eviction. A landlord or a property manager who touched a prospective tenant inappropriately when showing them a unit for rent. A maintenance worker who refused to provide any repairs until the tenant had sex with him. A housing authority official who offered to move a prospective tenant up a housing waiting list in exchange for sex. And a landlord who made sexually suggestive comments to a tenant, which caused the tenant to alter their daily routines to avoid interacting with the landlord. A security guard who's in a building who repetitively made comments about a tenant's body. They had access to the tenant's personal information and sent the tenant provocative text messages. And the tenant suspected that the guard was entering the unit and the apartment without having purpose or permission to do so. So it really varies. And as you can see, there's a wide range of people who may have opportunity to commit harassment, ranging from a landlord or a property owner to a property manager to housing staff, even an outside vendor or contractor who comes in to provide services, but isn't officially on staff with a housing provider, as well as other tenants in a property. So it's most commonly reported that men harass women. That's the most common type of harassment that's reported. But it is equally unlawful for women to harass men, for women to harass women, for men to harass men, as well as people who don't identify as either a man or a woman, but would identify with a different sexual identity. Um, we do know that statistics do show increasing complaints in terms of same-sex harassments and in complaints based on sexual orientation and gender identity, which do fall under sexual harassment. So that might look like intentionally, continually using wrong pronouns for an individual, barring them from using a bathroom of their choice, invasive questions about sexuality or potential surgeries, physical characteristics, and embarrassing questions. So I'd love for you to put in the chat, if you all are willing. Why do you think folks don't report sexual harassment when it occurs? What are some of those barriers? And while I'm waiting for folks to put that in the chat, um, I do want to say that harassment is underreported. There was a recent study of low-income female tenants that was conducted in Missouri, and they found that 10% of those who responded reported experiencing harassment. None of them filed a complaint, although many of them were forced to move and leave their housing. The National Fair Housing Alliance, which does an annual report on nationwide fair housing, they reported in 2022 that 183 complaints were filed nationwide with fair housing agencies or with HUD. And while that's a 22% increase from the previous year, that's clearly an undercount, and this is a much more prevalent issue than those numbers would suggest. So I see in the chat fear of retaliation, and that's absolutely true, especially when you don't have other housing options. When you're afraid of losing your housing, when you know that your housing provider has the keys to your unit and controls that, that can be a really powerful deterring force, keeping you from reporting any issues. I see in the chat possible eviction and homelessness, along with an eviction on the record or losing housing vouchers or public assistance. That's huge. Not having other viable housing options can keep someone in their housing, even if a situation is potentially harmful to them, if there's harassment that might be occurring. The power dynamics at play can be really significant, with the landlord or the property manager really holding the power in a situation. When we look at risk factors for someone experiencing harassment, it's more likely to be someone who's female, who's a person of color, who's younger, typically in the younger 20s, folks who have kids in their households. Other factors include having a lack of funds to be able to pay the rent, being less likely to be able to secure alternative housing because of some of those issues that were put in the chat: poor housing history, poor credit, previous involvement in the criminal justice system that would prevent them from being able to obtain other quality housing in the future. Some other reasons for lack of reportment include victim blaming. So saying, you probably encouraged that behavior because of how you dressed, because of your body. We all know that that's not valid, but there's still that stigma around it. There could be damage to reputation, a fear of being stereotyped or outed, as well as a fear that there might not be any action taken, that the complaint might not be taken seriously, that really can deter people from seeking justice and seeking appropriate actions to be taken to prevent this from happening to others. All right, so we're going to talk about addressing harassment, and we know that we've got folks on this call here from a variety of different roles, different professions. So I want to let you know that we're going to be talking about this from steps that people who are housing providers can take, as well as folks who are seeking to advocate for themselves or for others as well. There's a role for all of us to play in this. But starting off from a housing provider, the first step you want to take if you are made aware that there's an allegation of harassment, you want to promptly investigate this to make sure that it's taken seriously, gathering appropriate information, including the victim's name, the contact information, a summary of what has happened, as well as any potential witnesses that may have seen or heard about the situation. And then after conducting that thorough investigation, you want to promptly provide the findings to the person who made the complaint. If it's found that the complaint is valid, take timely and appropriate action against the harasser to ensure that this harassment stops and that this individual cannot take these actions against other tenants as well. In some cases, depending on what's being reported, criminal charges should be filed as well. Now, even if the complaint is not found to have merit, it's still important to close the loop with the person who reported it, explaining the reasons why action is not being pursued at this time. So that way, that individual knows that this complaint was taken seriously and due diligence was taken. You want to make sure that records of all complaints are kept in both the alleged victim as well as the alleged harasser's files. I want to take a moment to talk about liability. So a housing provider may be held liable if the harassment is committed by any employee or an agent of the housing provider, even if the management isn't aware of this. If the housing provider failed to take actions within their power to stop that harassment, whether it's by their employees or by third parties, outside vendors or contractors, if they knew about this, the harassment or should have known about the harassment, they can be held liable for that. Now, even if the person gives in to the unwelcome request or demand, if they acquiesce, that doesn't matter. That doesn't negate the housing provider's liability. Excuse me. And no psychological or physical harm must be demonstrated in order to provide that a hostile environment does exist. There's no change to the benefits, to the terms, or the conditions of the housing that need to happen in order for a hostile environment claim to be successful. And a single act of harassment may constitute unlawful harassment if it's severe enough. All right, so that was covering investigating and addressing harassment, but let's talk about preventing it from happening at all, right? That's the ideal situation when we're creating environments where harassment has no place in our housing systems. So looking at a housing provider's role, first off, they should establish and enforce anti-harassment policies for anyone that has any contact with tenants or potential tenants. So not just with their team, but anyone that's working with them should be aware of this housing provider's stance and policies and how they'll be enforced. We recommend that housing providers require all staff to regularly attend fair housing training that specifically addresses how to spot harassment, how to prevent it, and how to correct it. So that way everyone feels empowered to be able to take their appropriate role in stopping harassment. We recommend that there's multiple avenues for reporting harassment. Why is that? Well, someone might not feel comfortable reporting to a specific individual based on their relationship with them, based on their experience with them. It might not be someone they feel comfortable reporting it to, but if there's multiple ways they can do that, that will increase the likelihood that people will effectively take the steps to report the harassment. And a housing provider must also protect anyone who reports harassment from retaliation. No one is going to want to report harassment or other behavior if they're going to experience negative consequences from other staff, from other tenants, from other people in the housing complex. So it's important to make sure that those protections are clear and explicit. And there should be a central person responsible for receiving and investigating complaints. I did say multiple avenues for reporting, but then one person should ultimately have that responsibility for being accountable for investigating those complaints. And in day-to-day business, it's important to keep housing transactions professional between with both tenants and people who are potential tenants. Not initiating hugs, kissing, or any form of touching, not making comments, especially regarding someone's physical appearance, not asking personal questions, and not entering a tenant's unit unless it's absolutely needed for maintenance or inspection purposes. Sometimes it's not always how it's intended, but how it's taken. So I know specifically regarding someone's personal appearance, it could be a comment that is intended to be very complimentary, but it could be taken in a different spirit. So it's important to make sure that the way we're speaking to each other in the housing context is kept to be very professional to avoid any misunderstandings that could open up a housing provider to liability. And anyone who's working with a housing provider should make sure that they keep their eyes and ears open. If there is any behavior that could be understood to be harassment, even if it seems welcome, it's important to not ignore it, to not stay silent and play along, but to make sure that you're reporting that potential harassment to the appropriate person. And if you are someone who's in a management role, it's important that you take immediate action. All right. So for those of you who are not housing providers on this call, it's important that you know your rights and you know the rights of the people that you're working with. So that way you know how to report to the appropriate party, whether it's a housing provider, whether it's someone at a housing authority or some other type of housing assistance program. You know how you can make that report and have that investigated, or how to file a complaint with our agency, which we will discuss in just a moment. There have been a number of situations that have been reported of housing providers cornering their tenants in private settings, whether it's in their housing unit, in a laundry room, in a space that's not usually used to conduct business. So it's important that if housing provider, a maintenance worker, someone that's involved in your housing, um, uh, you can make sure that you're discussing matters around your tenancy in professional settings, not in these private settings that may be more likely to foster inappropriate behavior. Always recommend that you save your written communication, particularly about any incidents for your record. If it didn't happen via text, via email, via a written notice, you can always note that down with the date, who it was from, the details of what happened, because these details are important if you would want to report it or to file a complaint. And then lastly, on a more global or systemic scale, it's important to advocate for more robust housing opportunities and assistance programs. As we talked about earlier in this discussion, housing providers often target folks who don't have other options, who are more likely to acquiesce because they're in a situation where they can't leave their housing. During COVID-19, we saw this a lot. A lot of folks were unexpectedly out of work. They couldn't pay their rent. They were stuck at home. And there were housing providers that took advantage of that situation, saying, hey, you can't pay your rent. Why don't we take care of it that way? A lot of folks felt like they didn't have other options. So the more that we can advocate for more affordable housing, for housing opportunities that are more inclusive, for individuals that face housing barriers, for assistance programs that are broadly accessible, the more folks know that they have options, that they don't need to acquiesce to these demands, and that they do have the power to be able to address these situations when they unfortunately do occur. All right. If folks want to file a complaint with our agency, if they're in a position where they believe they've experienced discrimination and harassment, I want them to know how to do that. So we're going to go over that at a high level. We've got more information on our website and our brochures that detail the specific steps. But broadly, the first step that someone would take would be to connect with our intake staff, whether that's calling, sending an email, filling out a discrimination form or a questionnaire. We've got these questionnaires to collect contact information, what you've experienced, as well as who you're filing the complaint against. Then it's the intake team's role to assess your information to see if this is a situation that we can investigate under our state law. Now, if this complaint is jurisdictional and it's timely, then the intake team will help you to finalize your complaint, and the person that you filed against will be notified. So we call the person who files the complaint the complainant, and the person who was filed against, we call them the respondent, just to let you know the terminology that will be used. So once that complaint is finalized, it's docketed and served, and then you begin working with an investigator. It's important for you to know that your investigator is a neutral party. Their responsibility is to investigate if there was a violation of our state law, the Human Relations Act. So they are not on the side of the complainant. They're not on the side of the respondent. Their responsibility is to see what happened and to see what evidence there is. So in the course of the investigation, they may ask for documents, they may ask to interview witnesses, to hold a fact-finding hearing, or to seek other ways of obtaining evidence. They also will explore if it might be possible to settle a case before a finding. If the case does not settle, and if it does proceed to a finding, there's two possible outcomes, either probable cause or no probable cause. If a case is found to have probable cause, it means that it's more likely than not that discrimination did occur, that there was enough evidence to determine that. And if that's the case, then the case will proceed either to conciliation, to public hearing in front of one of our hearing examiners or commissioners, or it may be filed in court. And at this point, the goal is to seek remedy for the discrimination that occurred. If there is no probable cause, that simply means there was not enough evidence to determine that that discrimination did occur. And we always get questions about the amount of time it takes for an investigation to get completed. And it really varies. It's based on the evidence, the situation, how quickly people respond, as well as other factors. So it's not really possible to give you an exact timeline to be able to anticipate. But I also want to make you aware of remedies that are available if there's a settlement, if there's probable cause of discrimination. There are remedies that can be pursued to make right the situation that happened, to address the housing discrimination. So if someone was unable to purchase or lease a home, if an eviction was started against them, a remedy might be being able to purchase or lease the home, or the eviction process was stopped, with the impact being that a complainant is able to access their housing. If an individual with a disability was denied reasonable or accommodation or modification, the remedy would be that they were granted this accommodation or modification, with the impact being that their disability-related housing needs have been met. If there were problematic lease provisions or policies, the remedy could be changes to these documents, with the impact being that both the complainant as well as other tenants would have ongoing fair lease terms and policies. There may be posting of fair housing notices as a remedy, ensuring that everyone will have knowledge of their fair housing rights as well as responsibilities going forward. And training for respondents would ensure that the respondent has knowledge of fair housing responsibilities and is able to comply with state and federal law going forward. There may be a reimbursement of fees and out-of-pocket expenses, because these are costs that shouldn't have had to been paid because of just the discrimination that occurred. So that could remedy that situation. And then in housing cases specifically, not in other types of cases that PHRC investigates, but housing cases, there may be money for humiliation and embarrassment, with complainant receiving compensation for those other costs associated with discriminatory actions. And lastly, if a case proceeds to public hearing, there may be a civil penalty that's assessed, which is the respondent paying the cost for violating our state law. And housing awards can be significant. You can see them on the screen here, and I do want to keep moving so that way we can get to the end and answer any questions that anyone has. But you can see these different cases listed on the screen. And when we do publicize our housing awards, they're posted on our social media, on our website as well, and you can see those as well. I wanted to provide some links to some federal efforts that have been taken to address sexual harassment in housing. Both the U.S. Department of Justice as well as the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development have taken specific initiatives in order to prevent this. And you can get links to their initiatives, which include some PSAs, some written materials, some videos, some case information that can help you increase your knowledge and your resources on this topic. But we've got resources here at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission as well. The first one I want to highlight is our Fair Housing line. You can see the number on the screen there, 855-866-5718. That'll go directly to a staff member who can answer your fair housing questions, whether you want information about filing a complaint or whether you're a housing provider that is trying to understand your obligations under the state law. This is a resource that's available to everyone if you have housing questions. If you'd like more in-depth fair housing training or consultation around a fair housing issue, I would love to talk with you about that. And we can design custom trainings that are designed to meet your needs. These Fair Housing and Power Hours are really broad, really not cursory overviews, but we only have an hour, right? And we're speaking to a wide audience. So these custom trainings are a way to really get in depth and to speak to an individual situation. We do offer these webinars every month, the last Wednesday of the month from noon to 1. And I think our next topic is Fair Housing Fundamentals, which covers discriminatory actions and laws. And then in March, we'll be talking about fair housing and hoarding. If you're looking for written materials, we've got that as well. We've got brochures, we've got fact sheets, we've got a report on the state of fair housing in Pennsylvania, and all of those are available on our website as well. And we've got a show on PCN TV called PHR Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century, in which our Director of Enforcement, Adrian Garcia, discusses various housing topics with experts, exploring issues that are preventing Pennsylvanians from having equal opportunity in housing, and initiatives that are going on to address that. It's an excellent program, the first and third Wednesday of the month at 3 o'clock. And we always post those on our YouTube when they're completed. So that way folks who don't have access to PCN can also check that out as well. And lastly, I want to highlight our upcoming Housing Equality Conference. We are almost to April, which is Fair Housing Month, and we are excited to be holding an in-person conference in Pittsburgh. That's going to be on Tuesday, April 16th, 2024. We've got some excellent topics, excellent speakers. I'm excited to share more information soon, but right now just save the dates, and we'll provide more details in the upcoming weeks, and registration will open next month. So you can sign up to participate in this event if you'd like. If you want to get on our mailing list for fair housing updates, you see a QR code on the screen right now. Please feel free to take out your phone, open your camera app, and click on the link that appears there. That's going to take you to a brief feedback survey, which provides really valuable information to us about the training, what you found helpful, what you would want to see in future trainings. And it also gives you the opportunity of putting your name and your email in there, so that way we can keep you in the loop with other fair housing resources and opportunities. You certainly don't have to put your name on there. If you want to submit a response anonymously, that's fine as well. You also see on our screen, we've got our contact info. You've got my name and email. Please feel free to use it as you have questions and requests, as well as our fair housing line. That reaches the end of the presentation, but I am happy to stay on the line. If folks have questions, whether it's about our topic of preventing sexual harassment in housing, or whether it's about more general fair housing inquiries, I would really encourage you to raise your hand, to put a question in the chat, and I'm happy to answer your questions at this time. But as we're waiting for any questions to maybe emerge from the chat, I do want to take the opportunity to thank you for spending your lunch hour with me today. It's always really encouraging to see folks seeking this fair housing information to equip themselves to know how to handle fair housing issues that occur in your line of work. So thank you for joining today, and thank you for your attentiveness. I will be sending out the recording from today's presentation, as well as the slides and some additional materials, and you'll receive that. So if you have any additional questions that pop up, please feel free to reach out to me via email. But because I don't see any questions, I am going to close out the meeting for today. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And one last thing, I'm sorry, I said I was signing off. I just want to say thank you to our ASL interpreter for providing that service and for making this training accessible. And thank you to our Director of Communication, Amanda Brothman, for providing technical assistance for this training as well. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.